Hey everyone, and welcome back to JavaScript in Metaphors. Today's topic is variables. And in order to understand variables, I'd like you to imagine for a second what it would be like if you didn't have your memory. You'd be unable to learn new skills, remember places, people, and conversations. And I wonder, what would your life look like if that happened? Most likely, you wouldn't be able to perform even slightly complex tasks because your memory is really what enables you to learn one thing and build upon that thing to do something more complex, like programming. So before you can run, you need to know how to walk. And before you can do complex mathematics, you need to know the basic mathematics. So in that regards, your memory is really powerful because it allows you to take what you have and build upon it to do more complex things. And this is the essence of what variables is in the context of the programming language. It's simply a way of storing data in the program so you can pull it out and use it later, and it serves as sort of the memory of the programming language. That means you can store the data and use it at a later point in time. And when I think about variables, I'm always reminded of a movie called Memento. And it's about this guy who's impaired his long term memory and is unable to store new memories. And in order to remember, he tattoos information on his body and he uses pictures. If you take a picture with a Polaroid camera, you get a real picture out. He has these pictures and he's written information on them. And to me, that's just a perfect example of what a variable is. It's an entity that holds some data that you've written down or you want to store for later. So I thought that was a really good example, and it just made it click a little bit for me when I thought about it in that way. All right, so let's take a look at some of the ways we can create variables in JavaScript. And in order to do that, we're going to go to codesandbox.io. So you can go to that link, codesandbox.io, and it's an online editor. And you can just sign in and create a new sandbox. And we'll create a vanilla sandbox. So that's just regular JS. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove all of this in here. And I'm going to create 3 variables. And we'll say const hello. And we'll say let. And then we'll say var hello2. And you can see I'm matching the variable with the content here. You do not need to do that at all. You can have anything you want in here. A variable can hold any value in the programming language. So this could be a string, it could be a boolean, it could be a function, which we're going to get to later. It could be any value in the JavaScript programming language. So if we log this out now in the console, we'll do console log hello, console log world, console log hello 2. So you can see here we are logging these values to the console, but we are referring to the key. So the key is the name of the variable. So that is the label for the value on the right hand side. So hello in this instance becomes the label for true. So when we reference hello, we get the value true, which you can see in the console here. And when we console log and refer to world, we get the value world, which you can also see in the console here. And the same thing with hello 2. When we refer to that label, we get the value logged to the console. And again, this could be anything. So you might be wondering, well, we have these 3 ways of declaring a variable. But what is the difference between them? And that's a very good question. And in order to understand it, we need to know a little bit more about JavaScript. And we need to understand that JavaScript is a language in constant change. So that means that every year there's going to be updates to the JavaScript language. And as we figure out better ways to do things, we're going to add them into the language. So for a long time, we only had var as a means of creating a variable. But looking to other programming languages and seeing a lot of problems cropping up with the way var works, which we'll take a look at later once we visited a few more concepts, we came up with these two ways of declaring a variable called const and let. So basically, const lets you define a variable, but if you try to reassign the value of that variable to something else, say we now want const hello to be false, we're going to get a type error because it's not going to allow you to reassign a variable of type const. So const in this scenario is going to be read-only. And if you want to have a variable you can change, you can use let. So if you want to say, for example, world equals Vanaheim or something like that, then that's going to work as well, because we are allowed to reassign the let variable. So you can see that down here that we are able to reassign that variable. With var, there are no such rules. You can reassign it. You can do whatever you want with it. And it also has some other interesting properties that we'll look at later, but it's mainly connected to where you can access that variable. So with constant let, the only places you can access those variables are within the block scope that where you define them. So if we did this, let's say we created a block scope here, which we can do with curly brackets. Now, if we try to log this out, it's not going to work because they only exist within this block scope. So if we do it like this, all of our variables are in the block scope. But you can see that we have issues with hello and world because we're trying to access them outside of the block. And that's not going to work. So if we move this in here, so the console logs where we're accessing them, and then we'll remove this down here just to illustrate. Now we can see that we're able to log out the hello and world variable inside the block, and we're able to define the hello2 variable with the var keyword and access it on the outside. And this is going to be true for any block. So inside a function, inside an if-else statement, inside a for loop, the same rules are going to apply. And we're going to investigate that in more detail as we learn more concepts. Okay, so we've been through what variables are and a little bit about how they work, but let's take a look at how we're using them in our chat application. So if we take a look at our index.js file, you can see that we have a few variables here. So we have the root element, and we have the app container, and we store them in const variables, which means that they can't be reassigned. But as you can see, on line 7, we are storing the element of div into the app container. So basically what's happening is we're creating an element with document create elements, and we're getting an object back. Now we haven't talked about objects, but we'll get to that soon. And this object is going to have a few properties, and the way it's being accessed here on the next line, don't think too much about what's going on. Just know that on the line 7, we are storing the app container. And then on line 8, we are using the app container. So that's basically what the variables allow us to do. And we talked about that earlier, how we can store something for use later. And later, in this case, is on line 8. But if we look at the root element, we're not using that again before line 23. So we're storing it here, and then we're using it down here. And it's going to be the same throughout our program here. So here we have a variable called buttons, and it's holding a list of objects, which we'll get to how this works later, but we're storing it and then we're using it later. So down here, we are accessing the buttons variable and retrieving the content and doing something with it. And you can see we're using variables in lots of different places here just to be able to do something with the things that we are creating. So the data structures that we are creating, we want to modify that, and that's why we're storing it in a variable. So you can see that it's quite prevalent and quite well used throughout our application. And it's a really useful thing for us in programming because it means that, you know, we can build upon what we're creating. And that's it for variables. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you leave a like and subscribe. It'll help me massively and make sure that you get the latest updates. In the meantime, make sure that you practice these concepts on your own, and I'll see you in the next video.